do two different things. We're going to finish looking at some of the factors that affect the biome in any particular region that we're studying. And then we're going to start looking at some individual biomes. So to begin with, we want to go back to where we were. If you remember, we had mostly been talking about how climate and even the geography, or it's sometimes called the topography of the land, affect the environment. So you should be seeing our sequoia tree again. If you don't see our sequoia tree, let me know. So we were talking about the importance of water and other factors. And there are other ways to look at this. One of the ways, rather than thinking about, what we have in a particular environment, is to think of this in terms of individual species or the population of a species that's living in some area. So one of the things that ecologists have developed, and actually this was developed quite a while ago, is something called Liebig's law of the minimum. And this states that when we look at the growth of a plant, it'll be limited by the necessary factor. Now, the necessary factors are what the plant needs to grow. The necessary factor that's most deficient in a local environment could be nitrogen, it could be potassium, it could be sulfur, it could be phosphorus. Since this law was proposed, it's been applied to organisms other than plants, but it's definitely easiest to see in plants. One of the ways that the law of the minimum is often illustrated is by thinking of a population of organisms like water. And the bucket around the water represents their environment. And each stave or each slat of the bucket, this is an old-fashioned wooden bucket, each stave or slat is a different height. And the height represents how much of that particular environmental factor is available. So if we have a tall slat like this one in the middle in the back that kind of sticks up, there's a lot of that. If we have lower slats like the one in front that the water is spilling out of, there's less of these factors. So this comparison says, when we think of our population, think of filling up a bucket like this with water. If we're filling up a bucket like this with water, how much water this bucket will hold really depends on the lowest slat, because when the water gets to that level, it starts overflowing. Well, in terms of our environment, whichever nutrient, whichever necessary factor in Liebig's terms, whichever necessary factor is lowest, when the population hits that point, it runs up against a crunch. It's out of phosphorus, so it doesn't matter if there's more nitrogen or more potassium or more sulfur or more carbon or more whatever. If there's not enough phosphorus at this point, the population can't grow larger. And notice, we're not necessarily talking about there's no more phosphorus. There's no more phosphorus that this particular population can access. If we look at plants versus animals versus bacteria versus fungi, they have different capabilities. A lot of bacteria can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So when we hit whatever this minimum factor is, the growth of the population has to stop. If you've had a chemistry class, this is very similar to a concept that you've probably talked about in chemistry called limiting reactants. If we have an equation, we can look at that equation and we can, think of it like making a recipe. If we need a cup of sugar and 2 cups of flour to make our cake, if we have 2 cups of sugar, we can have 100 cups of flour. But if we need 1 cup of sugar to make 1 cake, if we have 2 cups of sugar, we can only make 2 cakes. So this is very similar to the idea of a limiting reactant in chemistry. Instead of setting limits on what our product is, this minimum necessary factor sets limits on how big our population can get. Another ecologist named Shelford came along, and he looked at this law and he said that this law is really too narrow in its scope and to how it's applied. And he came up with Shelford's law about the distribution of a species. And he said, think about any type of factor. So our x-axis always represents a gradient, a difference in this factor. So think of this like temperature, or the amount of precipitation, or the percentage of nitrogen that's found in the soil, or anything else that we want to study. But he said, if we look at a typical ecosystem, these factors aren't distributed equally. These factors are at low levels at certain points, they're at medium levels at other points, they're at high factors at other points. Now, keep in mind, if we're looking at a small ecosystem, if we're looking at something like one of the Cook County Park forest preserves, the temperature is pretty similar all the way across that forest preserve. But if we look on a broader scale, if we think of this forest as being an example of the temperate deciduous forest that's found in the Chicago area, the temperate deciduous forest goes all the way down through Tennessee and Kentucky, and temperatures there are different. Now, the y-axis represents how much of the population is found in different areas. So towards the middle of the gradient, we have some kind of optimum. Now, notice that although Shelford tended to think of this as the middle of the gradient, if you consider some of the factors that we've discussed this semester, if you've had a microbiology class, for instance, there are some bacteria that grow better at cold temperatures. There are some bacteria that grow better at hot temperatures. So the optimum for, if this graph represented temperature, the optimum for a species of bacteria that liked extremely hot temperatures, some of those archaea that we talked about a few weeks ago, their optimum might be shifted over towards the right. If we were looking at a cryobacteria that lives in cold environments in the Antarctic, their temperature graph might be shifted over a little bit to the left. So we tend to usually kind of redo our graph so it's centered on where the optimum is, but keep in mind that this optimum area isn't necessarily the average temperature. It could be higher or lower. And the same thing applies to precipitation or any other factor. So in the middle of the range, we have an area that's sometimes referred to the optimal range. This is where conditions are very good for this population. This is where most of the population will be concentrated because conditions are very good. If we look at people, for instance, and you study the physiology of people, most people have something called a thermoneutral range. And the thermoneutral range is where your body doesn't have to work harder to warm it up, or it doesn't have to work harder to cool it down. And for most people, this thermoneutral range is somewhere between about 69 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is similar to that idea. This is where an organism doesn't have to do much. Conditions are great. Now, at both extremes, beyond the optimal range, we have a range that's sometimes called the zone of stress or the zone of physiological stress. Think about that example I just mentioned a second ago. If the temperature, it might seem weird since human body temperature is about 98.6 degrees, but if you're in a room where the temperature is 80 degrees, at that point, that's a little too hot. And your body actually has to work to start cooling itself down. And similarly, if you're in a temperature in a room where the temperature is 65 degrees, that's below the thermoneutral range for most people. So your body has to start physiologically working hard to warm you up. So that's why this is the zone of physiological stress. Now, for populations, when we look at any factor like temperature, this range of stress, our zone of stress, only extends so far. If we keep increasing the temperature, at some point, people can't cope with that temperature. We simply can't survive. Now, if this is an environment that's found on Earth, what do we find? Well, then we don't find a population of humans living in that area. If humans try to colonize that area, they might become extinct. So the same applies to other types of organisms. So beyond the zone of physiological stress, we have a zone of intolerance, where the organism that we're looking at can't tolerate that condition, that temperature, might be the salinity of the water that an organism is living in, might be the amount of light that's available for a plant. You know, if we get beyond the zone of physiological stress, we're in what's called the zone of intolerance, and the species will be absent there. And one of the reasons that Shelford developed his ideas was, notice if we go back to our barrel analogy, this only tells us that sometimes there's not enough nitrogen or not enough phosphorus or not enough sunlight or whatever we're looking at. There's not enough of something for a population to survive or to grow beyond a certain point. What Shelford realized was, you know, too much of a good thing can be just as bad as not enough of it. You know, for people, we like temperatures to be relatively warm. But on the other hand, we don't like temperatures to be 130 degrees Fahrenheit, like they are out in the middle of some deserts. So, you know, too much of something can be just as big a problem as too little. And Shelford's law of tolerance recognized that. So he really expanded on what had been offered before. And as I say, we can apply these to anything. You know, exactly how we do the scale has to vary. We're talking about temperature, our x-axis is degrees. If we're talking about salinity in the water, then we're looking at parts per million salt or percentage sodium chloride or something like that. So the x-axis varies, but the y-axis is kind of always the same. Now notice it won't necessarily have a perfectly normal distribution, like we've seen in some instances. When we look at organisms moving to new environments, like those pioneer species we saw earlier, what's crucial here is the ability to disperse. Disperse is to move out, move apart. So dispersal can be active. We find birds on a lot of different areas where the original population didn't start. Why? Because they can fly. They can fly over mountains. They can fly over deserts. They can fly over large bodies of water like oceans or the Great Lakes. Now, occasionally, mammals can move across things like this. We actually have pretty good evidence that the monkeys that are found in South America and Central America actually immigrated to South America from Africa. And if we go way back to our original drawing, where we looked at the continents, the evidence that we have from fossils is that monkeys from Africa didn't colonize South America during the time when the two continents were together. They colonized South America when the two continents were apart. Think about your own neighborhood after a really big and violent storm. You've seen, you know, small branches from trees, maybe big branches from trees that are torn down. Depending on how much water there is, you might see a small branch with a couple leaves kind of floating in the gutter. And we actually have very good evidence that monkeys probably floated from Africa to South America on some sort of raft of vegetation. Now, it's very unlikely that this could happen, but one of the things we have to keep in mind, we talked about statistics a little bit earlier, when things are very unlikely, if we have millions of years and millions of opportunities, then even if it's very unlikely to happen with just, one toss of the dice, ultimately it becomes almost a certainty. So mammals can also disperse. Now notice when mammals are floating on a vegetation raft or mat, this is a little bit different than a bird flying from one area to another. A bird flying from one area to another is called active dispersal. The animal is actually doing something. Now notice that besides animals, other living organisms really can't engage in active dispersal. Other organisms, along with animals, like that float on vegetation mats, engage in what's called passive dispersal. Dandelion seeds are those little white things that you can see floating on the wind, or cottonwood seeds. And the seed doesn't really have an active part, but the wind carries it to a new location. Coconuts actually float to new islands. So if you look at the distribution of coconut trees on islands in the Pacific Ocean, coconut trees are almost always found very close to shore because they wash in on the tide. And eventually the coconut rots, the seed germinates. But we don't find them in the middle of the island on a higher area. Why? Because that's not how the seeds spread. Now, if we have some animals that carry the seeds, that's a possibility. And for plants particularly, a lot of plants disperse passively through animals. Remember when we talked about flowers, one of the things we said was the ovary, when it's fertilized, develops into a fruit. And the fruit is like nectar. The fruit does nothing for the plant. The fruit is a bribe to get an animal to eat the seed and carry the seed someplace else. If you have a park nearby, or if you have an area behind your house or something where all the power lines run, if you go out there sometime and you look along the power lines, you find all sorts of plants growing right underneath the power lines that you don't find in the middle of a yard. Why? Because if you've ever noticed, where do birds sit? They sit on these power lines. And when they sit on these power lines, the fruit that they ate earlier gets digested. Seeds usually have a hard covering, so they don't get digested. So they come out in the bird's feces. So for the plant, this is great. They get moved to a new location, and when they get moved to a new location, they come out in a pile of fertilizer. What could be better? So passive dispersal. When we talked about commensalism, remember that we talked about things like cockleburs that might stick to an animal's fur. And at some point later, the animal might chew these out or lose a hair. And so the seed gets deposited in a new location. Now, there's one more factor that we need to think about. And this is the soil that's found in an area. And when we look at soil, soil's really got two types of basic materials in it. There are some solid materials. And if we look at the solid materials, they're mostly minerals, which is another way of saying soil particles. But there is some organic material. Well, how does the organic material get there? Organisms that die, their bodies start to decompose, things like earthworms that crawl through the soil. But if we look at typical soil, about 50% of it is pores, gaps between the material. And out of these pores, about half of these pores are typically filled with water, and half of these pores are typically filled with air. So let's focus on the mineral particles, the things that make up what we think of as soil. And there are three basic types of particles in soil. There's something called clay. Clay has the smallest particle size. Clay particles are so small, the smaller the particles are, the less pore space there is between them. So when we look at clay particles, they're really tiny. And one of the consequences is this means that they can be packed very tightly together. And because they're packed very tightly together, this means when it rains and the clay starts absorbing moisture, it holds on to that moisture for a long time. Now remember, the clay is in the earth, and one of the things we said when we talked about the water cycle the other day is that water infiltrates or percolates through the soil and eventually gets down to that groundwater. But in the case of clay, it takes a long time for the water to percolate through that clay. So clay holds on to moisture for a long time, which might sound like it's good for plants, but there is a problem with clay. The particles are packed so close together, it can actually be hard for plant roots to push through the clay. So some clay in soil is useful, but too much usually makes it difficult for plants to grow. Depending on exactly where you live in this area, but in most parts of the Chicagoland area, once you get down about 1.5 feet or maybe 2 feet deep, you start hitting clay. So if you've ever seen where they're digging out someplace for a swimming pool, or if you've had to dig a hole in your backyard, sometimes you hit clay once you get more than 1 foot or 2 feet down into the soil. And if you've ever tried to dig out clay, you know how tightly packed it is and how hard those particles are. Now, silt particles are a little bit bigger than clay. And because they're a little bit bigger, they drain water more quickly. The biggest of all the types of particles, and notice this is giving you a rough idea of the difference in size. The biggest of the 3 types of soil particles are sand. And sand particles are about 100 times bigger than clay particles. Now, because the particles are big, you can't pack them very closely together. And because you can't pack them very closely together, sand actually loses water very quickly. Now, most of us are used to seeing sand at the beach, so that seems counterintuitive. But if you go up just a little bit from the shoreline onto the shore, the sand is very dry. You know, you might be getting sprayed with an occasional wave. You might feel the water coming in, but the sand is dry. Why is that? Because the water percolates down through the sand particles very quickly. So, you know, if you think about the beach, you know, what's one characteristic of environments that are dry? We don't have a lot of plants growing on them. So as a consequence, sandy soil is not good for plants. The best type of soil for plants is actually a mixture of these 3 types of particles. And when we have a mixture of these 3 types of particles, it's something called loam. And we have to have a mixture because, you know, as we talked about these 3, you know, there are pros and cons to each of them. But to have just sand or just silt or just clay is not necessarily good. A mixture is better. So if we look at the climate in an area, if we look at the geography, mountains, things like that, rivers, if we look at the type of soil, these are the main things that are going to ultimately affect the type of biome that we see. So we want to keep this in mind because, especially due to our bias as humans, we tend to think of humans controlling the environment. But notice that in the biomes that we find around the earth, humans have a minor impact compared to temperature, which is determined by solar radiation, the, you know, wind currents, water currents, things like that. So we want to keep that in mind because we're animals, so we tend to think animals control the environment. but that's only true to a very minor extent. And even when we think about human control of the environment, keep in mind, if humans could really control the environment, you know, it wouldn't be raining every time you want to have a picnic in the spring or summer. So let's leave that screen and let's start looking at some specific environments. So you should see a pyramid again. Let me know if you don't see that pyramid because I've got you on the wrong page. Now we've seen a lot of different pyramids, and this is a pyramid that actually is more like a graph. And what we have is two factors being graphed here. And we have temperature being graphed, and we have moisture being graphed. So on this pyramid, they have cold at the top, cold weather, and they have hot weather, a hot climate down at the bottom. And the reason they did this is just because we don't have as many biomes in cold weather. So it makes a prettier picture. Otherwise, we'd have a pyramid, but it would be standing on its tip. On our x-axis, very dry environments are located over to the left. Wet environments are over to the right. So you can get an idea. There are several types of environments. One is the polar environment, which we won't really talk about because that's not usually considered to even be a biome, because the true polar environment is what we find at the North and South Pole. And we really don't have animals living in those regions. There are animals living in the water at the North Pole underneath the ice and snow. But if we go to the South Pole, there really are not very many animals that are native to that area. The biome that has the coldest and temperatures is the tundra, which is, if we look in the Northern Hemisphere, the tundra is what we find in Northern Russia and in Siberia and in Alaska and in Canada. But notice it's only found in the northern parts of those areas. Southern Alaska is not tundra. Southern Canada, if you go up to Ontario or Ottawa, that's not tundra. Southern Russia is not tundra. Now, slightly cooler than that, and also notice that as we go down, we typically see a wider range of temperatures. Slightly cooler than that is the boreal forest, or it's sometimes called the taiga, or the coniferous forest. And even though it's not usually called the coniferous forest, this is probably the best name in terms of telling us what we find in this environment. The coniferous forest, most of the trees are conifers, they're cone-bearing trees. So think about if you would go northwest from where we are in the Chicago region, or northeast, if you go up through Michigan, or if you go up through Wisconsin and Minnesota, you get away from forests like our forests that have deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall, and you get into coniferous trees, the pine trees. So that's the boreal forest. And the boreal forest really forms pretty much a continuous band across the northern United States and southern Canada, from one coast to the other. And in Africa, we don't find it, but we do find coniferous forest in Northern Europe and Asia. And this environment seems to be very similar from one part of the environment to the other, from one part of the world to the other, I guess I should say. Now, slightly warmer than that, we find cold deserts. So we often think of deserts as being hot, but notice that that's not the only type of desert. The key thing for making something a desert is very little moisture. And we also find prairies. And notice that in prairies, the temperature can be about the same as in a cold desert. But if you look on the x-axis, they're a little bit further to the right, which means they get a little more rain. And then we find the temperate deciduous forest, which gets a little more rain than the prairie does. And keep in mind, prairies are often called grasslands. Trees need more water than grasses do. But otherwise, the temperatures are basically the same. And if we would look here in Illinois, the two biomes that we see here in Illinois are the prairie, it's sometimes called the temperate grassland, and the temperate deciduous forest. And then the areas that are even hotter than that are warm deserts. And they say temperate grasslands, but a lot of people group that with prairies. And savannas, which are areas where there are very widely spaced trees. We see savannas in some parts of the Mediterranean, and around the Mediterranean Sea, and in some parts of Africa. And then tropical forests, whether it's a tropical deciduous forest or a tropical rainforest. So we can think of the biomes of the earth. Remember what we've been saying for the last day or two, that what determines the biome in an area: climate, soil, geography, solar radiation. You know, if we think about temperature and moisture, then this is an easy way to kind of divide biomes up. Now, if we look at a slightly different way of representing this, let's actually put some numbers here. And let's look, sorry, I couldn't find a good graph I like, but the precipitation is on the x-axis again, and we're going from dry to wet. But on the y-axis, the temperature axis is reversed. Warm temperatures are at the top, cold temperatures are at the bottom. And one of the things to notice is, you know, this doesn't show all the biomes that were shown on the left, but one of the things to notice is that most of the biomes have an area that they occupy that's really unique to them. But at the same time, there's some overlap. So you might question, how can there be some overlap? How can an area where the temperature range is basically the same and the precipitation is basically the same, how can we get two different things, like a desert or a grassland, where the desert is this darker yellow, kind of almost orangish, and the grassland is the yellow? How can we get two different biomes in the same environment? Well, remember what we said about geography. So temperature and precipitation aren't the only two factors that affect a biome. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, the other thing to notice is this graph on the right only shows really 6 biomes. And it would definitely get confusing if we had all the other biomes on here. But something to keep in mind in general is when scientists look at the biomes, one of the things they see is something we talked about on several other occasions. When people divide parts of the world up into biomes, there are lumpers and there are splitters. So I mentioned a moment ago, if we look at our pyramid on the left here, the temperate grassland and the prairie, and sometimes even the savanna, are all grouped together as grasslands. And sometimes they're separated out. So when we look at how biomes are subdivided into categories, part of it depends on whether the person doing the subdividing is a lumper. And a lumper might look at the prairie and the temperate grassland and the savanna and say, well, you know what? They're all at roughly the same temperature range. They're all at roughly the same moisture range. The dominant plants in all of these areas are grasses. So they're really one biome. And other people, like the person who drew this pyramid, says, well, you know, there are some minor differences, and those differences are important enough. We should separate them into 3 biomes. So, you know, if you look up anything about biomes online, keep in mind that, depending on who's naming the biomes, about the minimum I've seen is 6 or 7, and the maximum I've seen is about 18. But you might only see 6 biomes listed in the different types of biomes. You might see close to 20. So keep that in mind. So these factors, along with things like soil that we really can't see on these graphs, and along with things like geography that we really can't see, can affect the biome. So even though this is biology, notice that living organisms really play second fiddle to the abiotic factors in determining what type of biome that we have in an area. However, once living organisms come in, the plants especially can exert a feedback effect on the climate. One of the things that we see in tropical rainforests. Now, when you think about a tropical rainforest, think of Chicago. Chicago, our average annual precipitation is about 33 inches, really anywhere from about 30 to 40. The last couple of years have actually been relatively wet years, and we've gotten closer to 40 inches of precipitation. But so we're somewhere between about 30 and 40 inches of precipitation. If we look at tropical rainforests typically get around 120 inches of precipitation. Some get even more, up to 180 inches of precipitation. So imagine a tropical rainforest that gets 120 inches of precipitation. Each season of the year, they get about as much rain as we get in Chicago all year. And not just rain, we get snow too. So when we look at tropical rainforests, though, it turns out that the rainforest has a big impact on the climate. Remember that plants lose water by evapotranspiration. This is the water that evaporates out of the stomata in their leaves when they have the stomata open to let carbon dioxide in. It turns out in the tropical rainforest, we have kind of a roof of trees that covers most of the rainforest. So a lot of the water that evaporates out of the leaves gets trapped underneath this roof of trees. And as a result, the humidity in the rainforest is very high and decomposition is very fast. Because when it's nice and humid, things like molds and other types of fungus tend to like that. They grow very quickly. So decomposition is very fast. Now there's another factor. Some of this water does rise over the tops of the trees. But when it rises over the tops of the trees, this also creates high humidity right over the rainforest. So remember, we just said rainforests might get 30 inches of rain in a season. A lot of that rain comes from the water that the plants just lost. Basically, the water evaporates from the leaves of the plants, forms clouds right above the rainforest, rains right above the rainforest, gets absorbed by the plant roots, gets lost by the leaves. And so the same water essentially gets recycled over and over and over again. Now, we might think this is just an interesting fact, except as people have started cutting down the rainforest, we've discovered something not so good about the fact that the trees actually produce a lot of the rain in the rainforest. What happens if you cut down the trees in the rainforest? As happens in some countries, the trees get cut down either for lumbering to sell to industrialized countries for our furniture, or they get cut down for firewood. In some of these countries, a lot of people still rely on basically fires for their heating, if you want to call it that. And it also gets cut down to convert the land into agriculture, either to turn it into pastures for grazing cattle or to grow plants on it. The problem is, as soon as you cut down the trees in the tropical rainforest, precipitation drops to about what it is in Chicago. So precipitation starts to drop drastically. And guess what? Turns out the tropical rainforest isn't that great an area for growing plants. So when the trees get cut down in the tropical rainforest, usually within 5 or 6 years, the land is desert. Because for some reasons we'll talk about later, there aren't a lot of nutrients in the soil, so the land quickly becomes desert. And in fact, if you look at satellite images of the Earth and you look at, for instance, the Amazon rainforest in South America, or if you look at the Sahara Desert in Africa, about the only two biomes that you can really see changing when you look at satellite images of the Earth is you can see rainforests getting smaller and you can see deserts getting bigger. Africa is really noticeable just because the Sahara Desert is right north of most of the rainforest in Central Africa. And if you look at images of Africa from the sky, you can see the Sahara Desert going further and further south. And you can see the rainforest retreating in front of it. And it's not really the desert pushing the rainforest out. It's the rainforest being cut down and then gradually turning into desert. If you haven't accessed it, by the way, Google Maps has a great feature called time lapse. And in time lapse, what they have is for different parts of the Earth, they have satellite images that are uploaded from, from now, going back about 40 or 50 years. It depends on the exact part of the Earth. But you can actually see time lapses of how the environment has changed in some areas. So you can see the desert moving, expanding. You can see lakes shriveling up and drying up under global warming. So it's kind of a cool feature. So as we talk about biomes, keep in mind there are different numbers of biomes depending on who's doing the classification. The other thing is, when we talk about most of the biomes, I'll give you something in the definition about what the temperature is like, how much rainfall they get, some factors like that. But keep in mind the exact amount of rainfall that makes something a desert or a grassland, the exact temperature. Again, that's something that varies with the definition. So we don't want to get too trapped in those definitions. For deserts are dry. Keep in mind, if you look here at the kind of orangish or dark yellow, the temperature in the desert goes from way up here to way down here. So there are warm deserts, there are cold deserts. So we want to keep in mind that this is maybe not as cut and dry. And really, that's been one of the main themes that I've harped on all semester. But back in Biology 105, when we were essentially looking at metabolic reactions and biochemistry, everything was pretty straightforward in the sense that glycolysis always works the same way. We always get the same products. When we start looking at a bigger picture, when we look at the surface of the Earth, if we have the same reactants, meaning water, temperature, we don't always get the same products. Things are a little more variable. They're more complex. And remember, when we first started talking about ecology, this is one of the things we said. The higher a level we study ecology at, the more difficult it is to get definitive answers. If we just look at populations, it's real easy to find out if a population is shrinking, growing, or staying the same size. It's easy to find out where the population is. When we start looking at biomes, a little more complicated. So we're going to stop here for today unless there are any questions. If there are any questions, please ask them. And if not, I will let you go. And tomorrow we'll start looking at some of the individual biomes.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.
You too.
Mr. Griffith, are we going to have like a question soon?
Yeah, we'll have some questions, but really we only have one more big set of questions left. So we'll have a little set. I'll either give them to you tomorrow or Friday, and they'll probably be due Monday. And then we'll have a little set about next Wednesday or Thursday. And we'll have a big set next Thursday or so that will be due the week after during finals week.
So we have 3 more sets, right?
Yeah, 2 of them are pretty little though. They're more the ones that are like 20 points. So there are a couple questions. The
So,
last one is a big one, like the last one on plants or animals.
all right.
And that's kind of over everything in ecology.
Wow. Okay.
You're in good shape, so don't panic.
Yeah, I did the population, so I sent it in yesterday.
Okay.
I don't know if it's still gonna get graded though. I know it came in
I
late.
always grade them if they get turned in late. There is a 10% penalty unless it's the first one you've turned in, but
It's the
it's
first
good
one.
if you tell me, because I don't always go back on old assignments to check and see if somebody turned them in. Like when we got the midterm, somebody turned in the first set of questions on the bacteria and viruses, and I didn't grade it for a while till they told me they turned it in, because it's like, well, that was due 7 weeks ago.
So I mean, it's the first one, so I might not get penalized.
Yeah, even if you lose the 10% penalty, you still are going to get enough points that it will help your average.
All right. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Yeah, you too.